But in the war, 1917 and 1919, she was at base hospital number 5 in Bordeaux, France. If you don't know that unit, she was with the Harvard unit in the war. And this is Mary. Yeah, Mary has her greatest claim to fame in Kentucky, because she was born in Anderson. And now there's a portrait of her that resides in the State House in Kentucky. But like many people in Anderson, she had ties across the river as well. So she had various medical practices here in Evansville. But during the war, her hospital was frequently the victim of air raids by the Germans. So one in September 14th of 1917 killed 16 Allied soldiers. And another one on June 30th, 1918, that was where she kind of earned her claim to fame. She wrote in a letter home that was heavily censored that the day after the air raid, the colonel came to her and told her that she was the heroine of the night, because she had been knocked over by the force of the blast and picked herself up and took care of her ward and then attended to other soldiers. And another ward where a nurse had been injured. And then we found out later that she didn't write in her letter to the home that she had actually been injured and then attacked herself. So when she found out she was going to receive a medal and she was going to have her name in the dispatches, she wrote home and said that I told the colonel I didn't deserve all the credit. I only did my duty, stuck with my patients, kept them under control, tried to keep cool and keep my head. I didn't for 1 minute let them know that I was frightened. And that was the key piece of information and measure of a nurse in the war. Can you keep your cool and do your patients know that you're frightened? If you can do both of those things, keep them from seeing your fear and keep doing your job cool and collected, then that made an outstanding war nurse. Mary was recognized by the government of France, the United States government, and the British government for her actions. She received the French Cross of War. She received the U.S. Army Citation. And she received the British Royal Red Cross, and that was presented to her in Washington, D.C. by Prince Edward. She was also the first woman to be given the Purple Heart. This project, it had its origins in my office. We have, in the clerk's office, 50,000 cubic feet of historic records in Evansville from 1818 to present. And every once in a while, you get to open a box and find a little treasure you didn't know you were going to find. And inside one box were these registers of trained nurses. And there was another register of World War veterans, which I thought was interesting. Then you keep flipping in that register of veterans, and in the very back there's a separate pamphlet, and it says World War I women nurses. So I definitely had to immediately learn everything I possibly could about all of those women. And it pairs nicely with those registered nurses, or those trained nurses registers. Basically, in that time period, 1905 in Evansville, where nursing becomes professional. So that's when you start getting licensing procedures and standardized training and all of the things we think of today to make a professional treatment. And because you couldn't Google who your providers were, you could come to the clerk's office and look up the name, address, and telephone number when they got this of your nurses who often make home visits, or you can contact the nurse directly and make an appointment for your doctor. Additionally, these, in the clerk's office, these registers serve as your licensing procedure. So once you pass nursing school, and then you passed your state exam, you had to come to Evansville, if you're going to practice here, come to the clerk's office and register your license to say that I am allowed to practice nursing, and I have integrity of it. That was the purpose of those registers. And I'm just going to tell you a few of the stories today, because otherwise we'd be here all night. A few of these women, we'll kind of highlight their stories tonight, but there are literally thousands more that we could tell from that register, all the way up until World War II when we stopped keeping them. So when Europe went to war in 1914, Evansville certainly paid attention. We had, as a community, a lot of ties to Germany and Europe. We had, for example, 2 central high school teachers who were in Munich at the time and had to make their way back to Evansville amidst the conflict, and were one of many who found themselves in a refugee situation trying to flee Europe in the outbreak of the war. But our first women to join the conflict themselves were 2 Belgian immigrants in 1914. Their names were Anna Louise Wyron and Margot Kunzler. They worked at the Andres department store, and when the war broke out, they headed back to Brussels, where they were from, to join the Red Cross. The Evansville Courier wrote up an article about them. Their claim to fame locally was that they were always models when the department stores had their fashion shows. So the Courier said this about them. While other girl models sauntered about in rainbow silks and beautiful satins last week, delighting in autumn fashions, 2 little queens of the spring fashion show in nurses' caps and gowns were caring for the wounded of their country, forgetful of fashion carnivals and all gaiety in their old home in Evansville. And that's sort of where we stayed, just those women that we know of until 1917, when the U.S. entered the war. 1917 was a period of social change, especially for women. With the war came an influx of opportunity. A lot of what we think of as what happened for women in World War II started in World War I on a much smaller scale. So women entered the workforce in mass for the first time. They registered locally with a work committee, and then that committee would assign them a position or fill a position within the various businesses and industries in Evansville that needed them to replace a man who was going to be drafted. So that included work as factory workers, as clerks, as bank tellers, elevator operators, munitions factories. We had 2 English teachers who worked in the munitions factory in Indianapolis every summer until the war ended. And then they also worked in the canteens, the Red Cross, a lot of things that we think of when we think of women's war work. And then something you may not know is our local women who are artists volunteered their services to paint camouflage on various pieces of army equipment. I don't know if any of them were actually called, but they did register to do so. And then my favorite little nugget of information from this period is the women who were drafted or registered to work at the Desires factory. The foreman, when he was asked to kind of speak as to how that was working out, what was it like to have women in the factory, he told the newspaper he actually preferred women because they gossiped less and got more work done. I would definitely be remiss to not mention 3 women who went overseas but didn't actually go as nurses. The first is Corporal Pearl Chamley. She was one of only 300 women to serve in the United States Marines in World War I. So after speaking with the United States Marine Corps Museum, we believe that she was one of the first 5 women to ever join the Marine Corps. And if you ever go to the Marine Corps Museum, they have several of her pictures and personal items on display there. And then Laura Schlensker was one of the first women to serve in the Navy as a yeoman. Her official designation was a yeoman F, in parentheses. She had to make sure they knew you were a girl. And in the newspaper, or in all newspapers, they were often referred to as yeomanettes, because they thought it was a real juicy name that they could give. And both the Navy and the women hated it, and the women refused to answer to that. But it's something that's certainly kind of how they were known. And then one little interesting fact about Laura is that women who served as yeomen were often paid the same salary as the males who served as yeomen. If you don't know, maybe nomenclature, yeomen were often the clerks who kind of did that kind of thing. But their pay was $28.75 a month. Men and women. And then we had one woman from Evansville serve overseas with the WWI in France. I have yet to find her name, so if you think that's a relative of yours or a friend, let me know. Same with any of these women. If you think you know more information about them, please let me know. Because sometimes it's a little bit of a fishing expedition, and we're going back this far. So once we enter the war, the biggest thing that the Allies asked for initially are medical personnel. Because by this point in the war, they've been fighting since 1914. They've depleted a lot of their medical resources on the Western Front. So they said, send us nurses, send us doctors, send us medical units, send us medical supplies as fast as you possibly can. And that's how we began a mobilization on that front. The call went out from the government to the various nursing professional organizations, American Nursing Association and others. At this point, Clara D. Noyes was the American Nurses Association president, and she sent a letter to every Nurses Association, state and regional. And everybody got the same letter, and that was the call to action, where she asked all graduate nurses to mobilize for the war effort. And in that letter, she said that we nurses are the only women who have been trained for the incredibly great tasks to which we are called by our government. We are the only women whom the government permits to go with our Army and our Navy. To give you a snapshot of what nursing as a profession looked like in Evansville in 1917, we had 112 graduate nurses. So those were women who had gone to nursing school, passed their licensing exam, and were practicing. They worked in 6 hospitals, and then they also worked as private duty nurses. They came out of nursing schools at Gilbert, Hayden, and Crescent Sanitariums, and also at Walker Hospital, which became Welborn, if you aren't familiar with that name, and then Deaconess and St. Mary's. The United States was unique in how it treated nursing, our military nursing in particular, whereas France and Britain would take untrained women and make them basically assistant nurses. The United States did not do that. We required you to have your nurse. You had to go to nursing school, you had to have your license, and you had to generally have at least 3 years experience, although they loosened that up towards the end of the war. So you had to pass your exam, you had to have your license. For the most part, they required you to be single, although they did make a few exceptions for married women. And towards the end of the war, they also started making exceptions for women with children, and provided extra daycare options and increased the salary if you had a child. They were a mix, these nurses were a mix of working class and middle class women with society women joining as well. The society women often took public health on as a calling and focused their efforts on the prevention and treatment of tuberculosis and other kind of public health diseases at the time. And then that photograph here is from Deaconess Hospital. Their librarian sent it my way. That's their graduating class in 1918. So most of those women did not see war action, but they definitely had enlisted or tried to. Allie Butler is our recruiter. She tried to join the Navy. They said, that's great, but we want you to recruit first. So she wasn't real thrilled about that, but she did it. She was very successful at it. She was a Deaconess Hospital graduate, and she was also the head nurse at Deaconess. To kind of give you an idea of the scale of what she was trying to do, the United States military in 1917 had 403 women serving as military nurses. By 1919, they had 22,000 nurses. Wow. These women served, she recruited them to serve both stateside and overseas. And her recruiting basically took 2 stages. You had your graduate nurses who were ready to go. They met all the requirements. Even one that said you had to You couldn't serve if you had any male relatives serving, and the official reasoning for that was they were afraid that you might wander off and try to find your male relative instead of doing your job as a nurse. So none of the nurses were super thrilled with the implications of that. And most of these women that were graduate nurses were between the ages of 25 and 35. These were women who'd been on the job a little bit. They were comfortable with their skill set. They had specialties in anesthesia, in surgical nursing, in public health nursing, and various other specialties that the Army required, and they didn't require a lot of immediate supervision. They could be turned loose onto a ward immediately and provide help. The second stage was the Student Nurse Reserve Program. So that was women who either had not yet completed nursing school or had not yet completed the exam or licensing process. So they sped that up for women who were almost there to get them out faster, and then they set up the first of the Army nursing schools to train women to be nurses. And they also had over 1,000 schools throughout the country that they partnered with to start turning out nurses specifically for the war effort. So by the end of her first kind of campaign, 60 women from Evansville had signed up. Now, notice on the other slide, we only had 112 serving in all of Evansville. So the mayor kind of got concerned by that number. He's like, oh, guys, you got to slow down a little bit. There's no one here to take care of our sick. And that's where the student nursing program in Evansville really ramped up. And Evansville student nurses who were in the reserve program took care of a lot of the basic health needs in the hospital. So they didn't necessarily do all of the full nursing tasks, but they assisted in basic aid. And also in a lot of the public health tasks that the women who were leaving for war were leaving behind them. And then the women technically had to join the Red Cross first, and then the Army took the Red Cross over. So there's a misconception that these women didn't actually serve in the military, and they did. But they often had to join the Red Cross first just because of the way the bureaucratic paperwork was working at that time. Okay. So the Student Nurse Reserve, if you were not in nursing school, what they would do is you had to wait for a slot to be open because there were way more women who wanted these positions than there were slots to send you to school. So if you didn't, while you waited for your slot to open, that's when you went to your local hospital to help and also learn some skills until the Army put you in school. By 1918, 10,186 women would serve as reserve nurses in that corps. Their official mission statement was to fight disease at home, to fight war injury, and to be ready to serve. Once they enlisted in the reserve, they stood ready for the duration of the war, and they had no idea how long that would be. In Evansville, ballpark, another 60 women, give or take, signed up for that reserve. 5 of them were called up to active service. 3 of them are here on the slide, which I don't have photos of the other 2. But the other 2 were Lucille Graham and Lucy Byers. Louise Andrews was the daughter of the owner of the Andrews department store. Given how closely that store's employees were tied to the war effort from as early as 1914, as we learned from our Belgian friends, it was a store that really believed in supporting the war effort wherever they can. So Louise was involved in the nurse corps, but she was also involved on the home front. So she raised money for Christmas programs for children whose fathers were deployed overseas. She fundraised in many, many, many ways, but she personally adopted 5 war orphans from France that she financially supported. She also worked with the St. Lucas Red Cross, and she worked on bandages for them, and then she was eventually called up and sent to the Washington Park Hospital in Washington, D.C. to learn her nursing skills. Dorothy Bowen, she was sent to South Carolina at Camp Jackson. She was specifically tasked to work on the influenza outbreak because not only did they have to deal with war, they had to deal with the 1918 fluid in it. So nursing, there was always more nurses needed than they had, no matter how many they turned out. And then Mary Keeney, in the middle, was a promising young actress who was at the University of Wisconsin. And she left the university to join Student Nursing Reserve, and was also called up to an Army nursing training school. She was our youngest woman to serve as a nurse at 21 years old. And when she came back to Evansville after her war experience, she became a very active suffragette, like many of the women nurses who served both stateside and overseas. Catherine Rice Steiner served here with hospital number 22. This is the University of Louisville Hospital Unit. We had about 12 women from Evansville all go with the University of Louisville unit. She writes a lot of letters home. She had a very prominent family, so they would publish all of her letters in the newspaper. And her letters often focused on how prepared they were for the tasks ahead of them. And every letter she appealed to her friends who were nurses back in Evansville, and you have to come over here with me. You guys don't understand. The need is so great. You need to come join me. So every letter that was highlighted. She's a society woman. So she highlights that shift in roles that women are experiencing at that time. I mean, she's a woman who generally was not allowed out at night unsupervised, who now suddenly has a ward of 100 critically wounded soldiers, and also has to serve as a diplomat, because women were the first Americans in France. So they had to play that diplomatic role as well. But her comment was kind of how appalled she was that she had to do her own laundry and make her own bed. She was not thrilled with that. Someone had to teach her how to do the laundry because she didn't know how to do it. So in writing one of her socialite friends back in Evansville, she starts it out with, "Oh, there will be changes in your girl when you see her again, my dear." And I imagine the laundry had something to do with that. But don't fear for her, because by the midpoint of her tour, she had hired French women to both do her laundry and make her bed. And then this is Emma Ham. She is on our t-shirt back there that we used her at funny for the exhibit at the Wartime Museum. I would have been friends with this woman. She was a Spitfire for sure. She was one of the first women to join the Navy in the country as a nurse in 1918. She tried to do this several times, and the recruiter's like, "I can't accept women." And she's like, "But you're going to accept me." And so they went back and forth a lot on that. And then she got a national newspaper sent to her home in Evansville. And I don't know which one it is, but when it was published in that paper that the Secretary of the Navy had declared that women would be allowed in Navy nursing, she shows up on his door and says, "You have to let me in." It says right there in the paper. And he's like, he hasn't read the order yet. It hasn't made it to him. But she had it, so she had to wait 2 more days so that the paperwork could get to him, and then she enlisted in the Navy. Lena Higby was the woman who actually enlisted her, and fun fact about Lena, she's one of the most decorated women to ever serve in the military, and she was also the first woman that the Navy named a ship after. So that kind of gives you context for where Emma is in the history of the United States Navy. Emma was a public health nurse. She was a Red Cross nurse. She came here to work on the tuberculosis problem, because Evansville, one of many areas, that was a big concern that was happening. She was from the Cumberland Mountain region, and she had no formal schooling before the age of 19. At which point she decided that she didn't want to live that life anymore, and went back and got all of her schooling finished. She got a scholarship to Waverly Hills University in Kentucky. Went to nursing school and then joined the Red Cross. She was sent back to Appalachia as a Red Cross public health nurse, and from there she came to Evansville. So, given the fact that she was one of the first women to join the Navy, she kind of garnered a lot of publicity and attention. So there's all these reporters asking her, like, "How are you going to join the Navy? Like, how are you going to do that?" And she's like, I got this. I've taken care of myself since I was a little girl, and I can take care of myself now. And they also asked her, well, what are you going to do? And she said, look, I'm willing to risk my life in the same, just as much as the sailors. And she says, I want to be where the fighting is the thickest. So she requested to be sent with the Navy on a destroyer. The Navy did not do that. They did not want to put women on ships yet. So she was sent to a debarkation hospital. So she took care of soldiers and sailors who were leaving, and soldiers and sailors who were coming home. So the ones coming home were often wounded more. The ones that were supposed to going out were often wounded in training. So that's a lot of what she did. And Habenik is kind of she's sort of our kind of capstone experience for what the women did when they were overseas in France. Before she was a nurse, she was a teacher at Stanley Hall. She went to Trinity Methodist Church and was very active there. And then she was a St. Mary's graduate from St. Mary's Nursing School. She joined the Army in 1911 and served at Walter Reed Hospital. And after that, she came back and set up the Visiting Nurse Association in Evansville. After that, she was sent to St. Louis to work on their Visiting Nurse Association. And that's when the war broke out. So she joined up with her friends at the Washington University Unit Hospital, Base Hospital 21. She was one of the first 6 units in France. They would have been over sooner, but there was a shortage in supplies, so they were stuck on Ellis Island waiting for their uniforms to join them. And what they did was support British forces. She almost didn't make it because she was accused of being a spy. A jealous co-worker had reported her to the government because a few years prior she had taken a position that she wanted. So she called and told the government that Emma Habenik supported the Kaiser. And this was overheard on one of those multiple party phone lines. So the government sent out an inspector and an agent to do the whole investigation. And he was like, wait, she was already in the Army. And so that cleared up very quickly, and he chalked it up to in his report jealousy, and he made a comment about like West Side politics. And then she was cleared, and she was allowed to go on her life. We know a little bit more about what she did overseas because Julia Stimson wrote about her in a book she published about their experiences at Base Hospital 21. And that book was called Finding Themselves. Julia Stimson became, by the end of the war, she was the head of the entire Army nursing program. So every nurse in the Army was one of her charges. Base Hospital 21 was in Rouen, France, and it was a Grand Prix race course that they took over. And she says that Miss Habenik is the day medical supervisor. The place is so big and there are so many tents to be covered. We have to have a supervisor for the medical side and a separate one for the surgical side, both day and night. This is one of the areas that she worked. This is the surgical tent. It is operating suite 6. They would do 6 surgeries constantly going at one time. Each of these big hospitals had a specialty. So this one focused on multiple compound fractures, amputations, and chemical weapons exposure. The conditions were rough. I mean, they were a little bit nicer because they had some of the pre-existing buildings in the race course. But the rest of them were very hastily constructed and plywood thrown together and then they move on. So they would write that when the storms would kick up, the roof would lift. And so they've got a patient on the table so the nurse would not have to lean over so the debris didn't get in the way of the patient. The biggest complaint that it was that these weren't sterile areas. And it's hard to kind of imagine what medicine was like in 1917, 1918, but it wasn't, it wasn't that far away from what we have now. A lot of the things and advances that we have now are because of this set of women and this set of experiences. So they were definitely concerned that they were not working in this sterile area, especially because there were no antibiotics. So if you got an infection, that was extremely serious. no heat. They had to boil water. So that's what's happening over here. They're getting their little pitchers of boiled water. Off in their living quarters, the floors were dirt. There was no heat in there, so they would talk about taking a hot water bottle to sleep with to keep them warm, and they'd wake up and they would be frozen. There were also food shortages, and as Mary Arden can tell you, base hospitals make very nice bombing targets for the Germans. So that was always a risk. This is the backside of the ruined hospital. There were actually 5 hospitals at this location, staffed by multiple nations. So if you check over here to the side, you can see a British flag, French flag. You've got a Japanese flag back there, and there is also an Australian flag, as well as the big US flag on the tent. And if your day as a nurse was not hard enough, after you got done doing your shift, you were also in charge of planning entertainment and keeping up the morale of all the patients under your care. So they performed plays, they performed concerts, played the piano, and they sang. They put dances together. This is a maypole dance because they put together a circus, complete with animals. And my favorite activity that they planned is they played a baseball game against the doctors. But to even the odds out, they made the doctors all wear skirts. No photos still exist in that particular event, which makes me very sad. But what Julia Stimson writes about a lot, and what a lot of the women here in this unit talk about, is really being that first unit to France. They also had to act as dignitaries. So they had to deal with this emotional shift of, just dealing with the worst destruction that we've really seen, and then turn around and go to dinner. And with some, high-ranking French official who wants to tell you how great you are and wants to flirt with you, and just wants to kind of show you the highlight of France. And then you leave that dinner and you have to go back on shift into this wreckage of war. And they said that was the hardest part, is trying to manage your emotions, because as a nurse, as a war nurse especially, they were told in their packets of information, you were to be ladylike, you were to show no emotion, and you were to represent America. And those are the 3 most important things you were supposed to do besides treat the patient. Base Hospital 21 was responsible for treating casualties of the Battle of Amiens, the Amiens Offensive, and also the Battle of Passchendaele. If that name rings a bell, it's often thrown in with a quote that says, "War is hell, hell is Passchendaele." 475,000 men were killed or wounded over 3 months for less than 5 miles of territory gained. MS Hospital had 500 beds. During this offensive, at any one time, you could have as many as 2,275 patients in the hospital at once. And that statistic comes from their hospital logs. And then throughout the course of that offensive, they treated 60,000 men total. Because of the sheer volume of men, necessity became the mother of invention. So a lot, in talking to nurses and talking to Army nurses today, they really lay out the fact that the basis of our modern medicine is started in these base hospitals and in these medical tents. Base Hospital 21 was key in developing the triage system to save lives. Basically, they were all overwhelmed at all times. One nurse would be responsible for 100 critical patients, sometimes as many as 200 critical patients just on surgery. They also developed the portable trauma X-ray, which I am told was important because they didn't have to move the patients so much and save their lives, because if they had, especially this hospital, had multiple fractures, any healing that had been taking place would immediately kind of have to start over every time we moved the patient. So then they could bring the X-ray to the patient, and that's still used today. Also, there's the Carroll method, which sounds like a terrifying, terrible way to have to suffer through the healing of their wounds, because they would run tubes through the injury and keep it irrigated 5 times a day. It was a very manual process. It required a lot of bandages and a lot of keeping the wound very clean. And then the idea of the golden hour is it has its roots here as well. The Army figured out that if the sooner you treat a soldier, the better chance you have of saving his life. This was different from the British medical facility that they took over, who would basically get a wounded soldier off the battlefield. How to clean him up, give him a blanket, sit him in the corner of the bed until we see you in the morning. And that's, not what we did. We changed that. And developed this idea that you should treat the patient immediately. Additionally, we moved our nurses forward. Because if you can save a life by treating him immediately in your hospital, how many more lives can you save if you treat him on the battlefield, or you treat him just behind the battlefield line? This is probably the most fascinating aspect of the subject for me. Simply because when we learn about nursing in World War I, it's a very sanitized reality. It's, the mothers, they mothered their soldiers, they were the sisters, they're wearing this pristine white uniforms. And it's all very clinical, it's all very sterilized. And all of the propaganda tells us that they weren't anywhere near the front. They didn't see the war. They were safe back here where they can't get hurt and they can't really see anything. But the more you learn about these nurses, the more you realize that's a complete fabrication. It may be true for some women, but it was not true for a large number of women. These ideas that they're safe was a choice that the Army made. It was a choice that they made in their propaganda and a choice that they made in their recruiting efforts. Because how many people would let their daughters join if you were going to be shelled and bombed and blown up? But unfortunately, these have had really long-lasting effects. Because this is where the idea of men's service and women's service not being equal is really, it takes root. These women did not have rank. They were not awarded or earned by the military. And therefore, not only had to do their jobs, but they had to constantly fight the military bureaucracy for the respect they needed to do the job that would save the soldier's life. They served in mobile hospital units. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with war nursing today, but if you are wounded in the battlefield, you are back into a world-class facility, within 45 minutes, if not sooner. This is the first time that they do that. They moved nurses into these tents that they could literally take down and put back up as the battle lines move. But it also means if the battle lines move too quickly, the nurses will find themselves in the battle line. And, the Allied governments did not have a problem recognizing this. The British and the French constantly, at least compared to the United States government, gave out medals for the courage of women's actions. But we did not as the United States government. Because then we would have to acknowledge we were doing things like having our women go through gas training because they are going to be exposed to chemical weapons. When these mobile hospital units were built, there were actually more women that volunteered to be a part of them, knowing that they were going to be in significant risk than there were spaces to put them in. So the women had to go through the same trench training as the men. They had to learn to fight in a trench, and they had to learn to survive a gas attack in a trench. So I've got a video of what that training looked like. So this is the point where if you're squeamish, this is the one slide you might want to look away from. These women knew the importance of this training because they treated the effects of the gas attacks every day. So both of these young men had been exposed to mustard and chlorine gas. The nurses were taught to recognize the gases by smell, and were told that they had to secure their mask in 6 seconds or risk death. The nurses also faced the additional risk of exposure, or secondary exposure, in the surgery units. The men would come in and their clothing were covered in the chemical weapons, so as they were treating them, they would also be exposed to the chemical weapons. Sometimes they would be raided by the Germans. The Germans would drop bombs that had chemical weapons in them, and the nurses would have to complete their surgeries in the gas masks that we just saw. This is Laura Baker. This is a photo provided by a family member of hers. She was in France in 1917, and what I'd like you to notice in this one is just her uniform. Laura is not in the dress. She is in the men's trousers and full field uniform there, with her helmet and her gas mask. This is a family photo, so this was not one taken by the Army, or one that the Army censors would have let leave in the letter. So it's pretty rare. I haven't seen really any other photos of that full uniform. And that's what they wore in the mobile hospital units, because they had to move. You don't want to trip on your dress if you're running, from exploding bombs. So that's what they wore. But it's also just one of those things that we don't see really in any other official military trainings. These 3 women were the only women from Evansville to serve in Italy. They served with the St. Mary's Daughters of Charity unit, the Loyola unit, were the only U.S. nuns to serve in the war overseas. One of our Evansville women was a nun. That is Sister Lucia Dolan there in the middle. And then Ophelia Gomez and Catherine Ziliak were both lay women who left the nursing practice at St. Mary's to join the war effort. Catherine Ziliak was our oldest woman to serve at 40. Ophelia Gomez was 40 as well. So these were very experienced nurses, usually the head of their departments at St. Mary's. And in their hospital in Italy, they had battles that came up to the perimeter of their facility. They also faced shelling fire to the point where they kept having to put the supply room out and stop doing what they were doing because the supply room kept catching on fire from the shells that were exploding around them. They were also shorthanded. In diaries from this unit, they talk about just the illness. They were all getting sick because they were working 20-hour shifts. They didn't have water. They didn't have, food. They kept running out of bandages, so they had to boil them and use them again, which none of the nurses were thrilled with. And also just the kind of non-stop duration of what was going on was really wearing on these women. This is one of their hospital recovery units at that facility, the Daughters of Charity Hospital in Loyola. Most of these nurses did 2 and 3 jobs at once. So they would go from the surgical recovery critical care unit to the more advanced recovery unit and kind of bounce back and forth with the intake of new soldiers as well. This hospital also saw the 1918 flu a lot. that hit both the patients and the nurses. Catherine Ziliak, she caught the flu. It made her suffer a heart attack, and that was very much towards the end of 1919, and she was still recovering from the effects of all that on her way home. The other thing that particularly these nurses did is they served as the point of contact between a patient and his parents. When that soldier passed away in their care, they were the one that notified the parents. So that's what's happening before the military had that system in place to notify, and they would eventually notify as well, but often the letter came first from the nurse who saw him pass away. And that also was a hard thing for those nurses to deal with. And then the other thing that they had to do is they nursed the soldier back to health. He often came back for them because they sent him back to the battlefield. And that was the other hardest thing that they had to deal with. One quote from a nurse says that the despair of nursing is nursing a man back to health to a point at which he could again shoulder 80 pounds of marching kit, only to see them torn to pieces again on the firing line. So the Loyola unit comes home in 1919, and something we don't talk about a lot is the nurses suffered from shell shock, post-traumatic stress, as well as the men. One of the nurses from this unit, one of our nurses, in fact, wrote that she suffered a great deal from nervousness and is easily discouraged. Ophelia Gomez came home. She talked about her experiences probably the way I'm talking to you right now, one time. And then she was sent to a shell shock hospital in Washington, D.C., and she never left it. She died at age 98 in the Marion VA system. So she died amongst veterans of Vietnam. Wow. Sister Lucia came home and turned her experience into action. She founded the St. Vincent Daycare. She did just endless numbers of projects for working women and working in their child care. She saw that as a need. Working women need child care. And she worked on just a ton of those projects. It got to the point where the Daughters of Charity actually retired her and said, you need to kind of seek some treatment for what's going on here. And then Catherine Ziliak, when she arrived home, she eventually had a stroke, all from the effects of the flu that she received during her service, and then she passed away much sooner than she probably would have had she gone asleep. Mary Browning is another nurse in France. She originally started with the Louisville unit as well, but then she was transferred and was a hospital-trained nurse. And her family, that's a family photo as well, and her family members say that she was never the same after her wartime experience. She developed a debilitating fear of life, because that was a big problem in the trenches, to the point where she kept her head shaved continuously from the time of her return. And that she was, we probably call it depression today, traumatic experiences. Other women talk about hating fireworks, and they would go to the country around the 4th of July. A lot of just very traditional symptoms that we think of as post-traumatic stress these women had to deal with, and they had to deal with them on their own with no support. There was no Army, really medical facility focused on them or their needs. In fact, we're just starting to do that now. This is Emma Byrne. They called her the Sunshine Nurse. She was a public health nurse in the poorest areas of Evansville, and those areas were drafted heavily as well, so she actually would run into the people that she treated, the patients that she knew on the different battlefields, and then they would write home and say, I saw Emma, I saw the Sunshine Nurse. And they would, when they were injured, she actually treated several Evansville soldiers in France, and they would write those soldiers wrote their parents home and said, Emma, the Sunshine Nurse, is treating me, and everything is going to be fine. She never really left war nursing. She ran a free clinic both before and after the war at the old courthouse. And then she, something that is definitely against the odds, she pulled her next door neighbor out of an ambulance in France. He survived, fortunately, and she said that that was her best moment because it brought a little bit of her Evansville home to France. But she never left war nursing. When she came home, she went back to Bainey Camp Hospital. Because Bainey Camp Hospital had been turned into a treatment facility, a long-term treatment facility for soldiers who were wounded by gas. So they came home and they lived, but we did not have really the facilities to deal with their long-term needs. So we sent them to tuberculosis hospitals since they already treated respiratory illness. And she became an advocate for soldiers. If they needed socks, she got them socks. She brought in legal aid to help them apply for what would eventually become the VA system. She helped them with their disability claims. She went frantically around town, year after year after year, raising money for these soldiers, for these men, for Christmas baskets for them, for Easter baskets for them. And then she also helped them find their friends. So if they had a best friend that fought next to them in the trenches, she would work the network and send letters back and forth. And there were several soldiers that she reunited with friends and battle buddies. One of whom, these two men were the only surviving men in the unit, and she helped them reunite. So she did, so war nursing was something, and her wartime experience was something that never left her, and was really that key focal point in her life. The Eloise Cook, she is an example of our Evansville women who returned much later than the men did. Our nurses came home after the ticker tape parades and all the celebrations happened because someone had to keep nursing the men until they were able to come in. Because these men were previously wounded, multiple amputations, abdominal wounds, severe facial wounds, and they weren't able to survive the trip, across the ocean to come back home. So Eloise Cook was our last nurse to return home in 1922. Multiple Evansville nurses found themselves focused on the rehabilitation of soldiers. So she was trained in the Whole House in Chicago, and then also served at Walter Reed. We actually had 4 nurses that served at Walter Reed. This is the period of time where we developed occupational therapy, physical therapy is developed, and a lot of those early techniques are actually performed by nurses and then break off to become separate medical specialties. So this photo here is from Walter Reed, and it's their amputation work. And this is Viola Burleson, and she was asked to provide a summary of her wartime experiences. And she gave this quote. She said, "It's a mixture of sadness, horror, and joy. Sadness that so many young men should have to go out to die before they really have a chance to live. The horror of seeing humanity slaughter each other, and the joy of being young and able to do my bit." These women were remarkable. They came home and they built the medical infrastructure we have today in Evansville. They built the philanthropical and charitable infrastructure that we still use today. They fought for their community on the home front as educators and advocates and activists. The war blew the doors off their expectations for themselves, and they came back to a society that didn't know what to do with them. They struggled to fit back into the rules that they left from society in the wartime. They came back to struggle with the jobs they were suddenly only allowed to do. They fought for the franchise because they couldn't vote on the war that they were sent to. They fought for labor rights for themselves and others. Our Evansville women led an Indiana coalition that went up to Indianapolis and fought for labor rights for nurses, for better pay, for standardized hours, for the professionalization of nursing services when the state tried to loosen the licensing requirements and allow women who hadn't been trained to nurse. It was our women who went to war that were the leaders of these organizations, Graduate Nurses Associations, American Nursing Association, and several others. These women stuck together. There weren't that, Evansville had a cluster that was larger than any other part of the state, except maybe Marion, and even there we might have drawn even. They formed a sisterhood. A lot of these women never married. They lived with the women they went to war with. Some of them lived on a 505 Washington Avenue, 6 at a time. They traveled together for the rest of their lives. Others purchased houses together, 2, 3, 4 at a time. They fought for recognition as veterans. They fought for participation in veterans organizations. They fought for war injury compensation, because so many of them came home with war injuries, including gas exposure, including injuries from shrapnel and shells. And they didn't have treatment that the men had available to them. And then as they got older, they had to fight for military burials and for military headstones. And some of those fights continue on today in some ways. This article is from an August 31st, 1919 article in the paper. And it says, feminine veterans will be powerful, exclusive people. Only 6 or 8 eligible to join the American Legion post. That was a little bit off. And then, but they don't have to wear a yard of whiskers. 142 women volunteered for war. 142 Evansville stories. We could be here all night telling them. Emma Hill was one of 14 women to serve in Siberia and Russia. Fanny Clark was the first, basically, to develop a 911 system in Evansville. Della Ingalls Smith started the first nursing home in Evansville and fought for all of the standards and professionalization protections that those residents require and benefit from today. Margaret Perkins received a medal for valor in combat after she jumped into a trench and pulled out a wounded man under shell fire. But by 1922, most of the public had forgotten them. General Pershing made a statement that no matter how patriotic or brave were the men, or how self-sacrificing, the women always did them one better. In 1925, war memorials and monuments had been built to almost every aspect of the war, even the sacrifice of war mules and horses. But a nurses' memorial was not built until 1938. Its plaque was not dedicated until 1971. Mariel St. Clair Stobert, the World War I nurse, made this statement on that day. She was elderly, and she said, I wonder if it would always be necessary to reserve honors for women until after they are dead. There are also 14 other women who we do not know the names of. There are 14 African American women who volunteered for the Student Nurse Reserve, but we didn't write their names down, so we don't know who they are. Nicole Stewart was one of the few African American women who were allowed to serve in the military in World War I. She served in Camp Grant, Illinois, and she said this. She said, we had no opportunity for service above and beyond the call of duty, but each one of us did contribute quietly and with dignity to the idea that justice demands professional equality for all qualified nurses. 23,000 women served as nurses in World War I in the United States. 200 of them died in service. They served stateside. They served on battlefields on the eastern and western fronts. They were surgical nurses, critical care nurses, anesthesiology nurses, public health nurses, mobile surgical unit nurses, and rehabilitation nurses. They performed with courage. They were healers in a world of destruction. And they held the hands of the dying and the scared young men and listened to their stories and assured them that they mattered. But so often, these women are forgotten. They were just a footnote, even a couple weekends ago at the big commemorations in France. And what they asked over and over and over again in every one of their letters, they would write things like this. This is Catherine Rice Center again. And she wrote, from this third-story window overlooking the most landscape sunset, tonight the same beautiful moon will shine on you all in our peaceful home, overlooking that beautiful river. Remember me to everyone on the hill. Think of me, pray for me. I need you all to help me. In service of mercy, Catherine. So before I close tonight, I just ask you to honor Catherine's wishes and remember these nurses and tell their stories, and think of them. And thank you all for being here today. If this is a program, or if this is a mission that you would support, we've got t-shirts that you can order from Steve. There's an example in the back, and all that money will go to building an exhibit that will honor these nurses long-term in our community. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Amber? I think we're all very overwhelmed. Are you going to write a book?
Maybe. I'm going to try. There's still so many of them. There's a few more details I'd like to hunt down, but I'm working on it. Yes?
Yes, Mary Arvin, I'd like to find that information because she was affiliate of John Harvey Kellogg of Battle Creek, Michigan, and they're the ones, the inventors of Kellogg's Corn Flakes. I wonder how I could pick up some of her advertisement because undoubtedly she had a health initiative here on preventative health in that area, probably one of the first in the United States. He was very popular. A lot of the wealthy went to Battle Creek. I've been there. He had some unorthodox treatments, but some of them played out where they're still being used today. I thought that was very interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, she had so many advertisements in the paper. If you go to the Evansville Public Library, they have the historic Evansville newspaper database. And you just search her name, and you kind of have to wade through a lot of things and make sure you put her name in quotation marks so you'll get a whole bunch of crazy things. And you can kind of pick her ads out that way and then clip and crop what you want. And then Kentucky has done a lot of research on her because they honored her in Frankfurt. So the National Guard there and some of the Army Public Affairs officers did an extended amount of research. And you can just Google her name. One of the National Guard write-ups that kind of summarizes her career is available really easily.
And she was the only nurse that received a Purple Heart.
She was the first.
The first.
Because there was like a wound strike. The initial designation was like a wound strike. And then when the Army instituted the Purple Heart as the award for wounded, you could then put in an application to have the person converted to a Purple Heart. And she was the first woman to do so.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, now there's a lot of physical and sexual abuse with women in the services. Did you find any of that back in that time period?
I'm going to put an asterisk by this statement because I don't know that this is fully vetted as I would like, but there was a Senate investigation. There were women who made complaints and reports to their senators, basically saying they were faced with unwelcome advances from soldiers. There was a period of time when the soldiers were not allowed to fraternize with women, and that was lifted. And when that was lifted, the women actually asked the Army to put it back in place because they were so overwhelmed that they couldn't do their jobs. And that was, in reading that investigation, it was shut down very quickly. There was basically a comment that says, we can't tell America's mothers